Rick is an ugly, disgusting, pathetic loser who decided to quit his job after working for 14 years as an adventurer guild clerk. Rick then disappeared for 2 years to be trained under the strongest team of adventurers to learn all the basic skills to become an F-rank adventurer. Rick gets thrown to the ground after a grueling training session. He's so exhausted that he thinks he won't live to see the next second. But his masters are impressed by how much he has improved over the past 2 years. They are convinced the E-rank test will be a piece of cake, but they hope they hold back so he doesn't end up destroying the arena. But Rick remarks that his strength is nothing compared to theirs. Upon returning to the city, Rick enters the Adventurers Guild to take the E-rank promotion test. Rick decides to walk over to the counter and present his guild ID. The receptionist is about to present him with his admission ticket when she recognizes him as her mentor. Rick remembers Alyssa, even though he hasn't seen her in 2 years. He's surprised that she's now working in the Central, but she tells him she was more surprised when he suddenly quit the guild back 2 years ago. She's even more bewildered that he's now an adventurer. Rick is uncertain because he knows it isn't smart to start as an adventurer by age 30. People usually start at the F rank during their teens and then get promoted to the E rank 2 years later. Alyssa wonders what Rick has been up to in the past 2 years, and he tells her that he was up in the mountains, training with some senior adventurers. A drunk adventurer suddenly walks up to the counter and rudely makes a pass at Alyssa. Alyssa tries to decline his request because it's still within her working hours, but the adventurer tries to force himself on her. Rick tries to get the adventurer to back off, but the adventurer is pissed that Rick is ruining his non-existent Riz game. Rick pulls him back and gives him a belly tap while Alyssa apologizes for the inconvenience caused. Rick doesn't mind because he had several cases like that working as a guild clerk in the past. The adventurer suddenly passes out in Rick's arms, which draws the attention of the other adventurers in the guild. Rick sets the adventurer on the floor and explains that he has too much to drink. He advises everyone to take that as a life lesson and always drink responsibly. Alyssa hands Rick his entrance ticket while wishing him luck in the test. Rick sees that he's contestant 4242 and he suddenly becomes worried because he has an unlucky number. Rick walks out of the guild where Rionette is waiting for him. Meanwhile, the other adventurers notice a handprint on the drunk adventurer's armor, and they're surprised by this. They recognize the drunk adventurer as Damold, a former A-rank adventurer who's wanted for assault. Alyssa thinks back, and she can't believe Rick's hand was imprinted on Damold's armor despite handling him so gently. Rick proceeds to a part of the guild where his details are recorded. His height is measured, but one of the clerks is surprised to see that Rick is 32 years old. After his physical stats have been taken, Rick proceeds to a room with a crystal ball where the participants' magic energy is measured. While most of the participants are ranked between D+ and C-, Rick barely generates any reaction. Rick is ranked as F-, which makes the other participants mock him for being old and useless. The participants note that he has the world record for the lowest magic ability, and they hope they don't turn out like him. The guild official is about to call up the next participant to the crystal ball, but to his immense surprise, the ball suddenly cracks from overload. Rick then walks into a hall where the participants are instructed to strike a slime bag with all of their strength so that their power can be measured. This brings back memories of Rick training with one of his masters who trained him using a golden slime bag. Back then, Rick was sure he wouldn't be able to destroy the bag because he wasn't strong enough. His master insisted that he must destroy the bag because it was a fundamental adventurer test. His master proceeds to destroy the bag easily, noting that he can destroy 200 slime bags at once. This motivated Rick to start training with the bag, racking up 50,000 punches per day. The participants are called up to take the punch test, and their abilities are noted by an observing official. One participant is called up, and some other participants recognize him as the second son of the Duke. Though he was only 11 years old, he was said to have the magic equivalent of a C-rank adventurer. The son of the Duke is so hyped to show off what he's made of to the other participants. He conjures a level 3 natural blaze magic to the surprise of everyone, but when he releases it, Rick notes that it's tiny. The other participants are impressed with the little impact the ball of flame has on the slime bag. The observer is also impressed by the abilities of the child prodigy. But Rick can't help but feel underwhelmed because that's not how he remembers the level 3 natural blaze magic spell. He recalls when his master also cast the same spell in the past, but it resulted in a huge fireball that burnt down a nearby forest. Rick concludes that the prince compressed his magic because they're indoors, and he silently praises him for being so talented. Other participants take their turn at the slime bag, and Rick notes that the green slime bag also has a high damage capacity. The moderator calls his number and walks up to the slime bag. The observer stops him, noting that he became an adventurer when he was already 30 years old. The observer is skeptical about Rick's abilities because he didn't train his magic when he was younger. He advises Rick to give up on his dreams because it is too late for him. Rick remembers his grueling training session with the golden slime bag. He punched the bag so much that his fists were bloody, but he was exhausted even though yet to complete his daily quota. His master motivated him to get back to his feet, and Rick did so because he didn't want to give up. Though Rick agreed with the observer, he wondered why older people weren't allowed to become adventurers irrespective of their age. Rick channels this rage as he strikes the slime bag, bursting it open and spilling slime everywhere. The other participants were so shocked they wondered who Rick was, but Rick thinks that the bag was defective. The Duke's son is pissed that Rick surpassed him, but he believes he will perform better in the defensive ability test. The participants move over the defense session, and Rick defends against a level 4 nature-composed magic, which proved to be too difficult for the others. The guild official commends his defensive abilities, impressed that Rick was able to use a level 1 nature-composed magic to counter his spell. The official decides to use a level 5 nature-composed magic spell, and he recommends that Rick use a higher spell level for defense. Rick shamefully admits that he can only use the level 1 nature-composed magic. The official is surprised by this because Rick's magic control is so precise, but Rick tells him not to worry, assuring him that he'll be alright. The official thinks that Rick is underestimating his abilities, and he decides not to hold back. He chants the incantation for his nature-composed magic spell and casts the level 5 winds spell at Rick. Rick easily defends against it, clearing out the magic spell without breaking a sweat. Sylvester, a first-class knight, notices this from a distance and wonders what is happening. He decides to visit the test area, and he arrives to meet some guild officials on the ground. They brief him on what happened, and the knight wonders if they're playing a prank on him. The female official shows him Rick's details, and he's surprised that Rick is 32. He also notes that he worked as a guild receptionist for 14 years and wonders if the clerk title was given to someone who defeated the dragon. But the official tells him it's not. Meanwhile, Rick joins the other participants to take a written test, and after the test, he sits on a bench outside with Rionette. She asks him how the test went, and he tells her he would get a perfect call because he put his 14-year experience as an office clerk to good use. Rick is concerned because he got an F- on his magical ability test, but Rionette reassures him that he would be alright. The Duke's son suddenly approaches Rick, addressing him as a commoner, but Rick has a problem remembering his name, which pisses him off. Freed suddenly starts crying, pointing out that Rick stood out more than him, preventing his official debut into the adventurer life. Rick is surprised that Greed is crying, but his senior sister and eldest child of the Duke, Angelica, suddenly steps in to teach Rick a lesson for making Freed cry. Angelica throws her glove at Rick, challenging him to a duel, but Rick picks up the glove, pointing out that nobles don't value clean clothes because they don't do their laundry. Rionette points out that he has accepted the duel by picking up the glove, and Rick can't believe it when it dawns on him. They proceed to the arena where Angelica asks that they each state their condition for the duel according to the rules of the Kingdom of Filheim. Angelica proposes that the loser will act as the victor's servant for life. Rick is worried because Angelica is a member of the Knights of the Realm, the protectors of the peace in the kingdom. Rionette points out that Angelica is equivalent to a B-rank adventurer, which worries Rick even more. But Rionette tells him to go easy on her. Rick doesn't fancy his chances because he's just an F-rank adventurer, but Rionette reminds him of his training in the past 2 years. Rick almost loses his mind remembering how bad his training was, but Rionette tells him to have more confidence because the Orichalcum Fist, the strongest party in the continent, considers him as their member. Rick is inspired, and he immediately regains his confidence. Angelica decides to go easy on him since he's just an F-rank adventurer as she draws her sword. Rick notices that she's a sword user who boosts her abilities with magic. She rushes at Rick, intentionally missing him to show off how fast she is. Rick appears stunned, and Freed tells him Angelica is so fast that she is nicknamed after the Flash. Rick doesn't seem impressed by this name, but Angelica promises to stop holding back in her next attack. She uses her speed ability again to try to attack Rick, but in his eyes, she's so slow that she appears to be running on water. He wonders what earned her nickname since she's so slow. He's lost in thought, but Rionette calls out to him, and he dodges Angelica's attack with ease. Angelica is surprised that Rick dodged her attack, but thinks it was luck and decides to attack him again. Rick is disappointed by how slow she is, but impressed by how strong he has become. Angelica suddenly trips on a stone, turning her lunge into a spinning attack that Rick is barely able to dodge. Rick couldn't read Angelica's movement, and he's on edge, but Angelica decides to act like her attack was on purpose even though she tripped. She tells Rick she will be attacking him with 3 times more speed than before, and she uses her ability, but she's still very slow from Rick's perspective. This time, Rick takes no chances and dodges her attack, to the surprise of Angelica. She can only use her advanced ability 2 more times, but she decides to go with it because she has no choice. She attacks Rick again, but he dodges it easily. She unleashes her last attack, but she trips, turning it into a low attack. Rick was ready to counter her attack, but her low attack took him by surprise. He quickly punches downwards, hoping to catch Angelica in time. This creates a huge hole, and Angelica is thankful that she tripped because she would have been on her way to the afterlife now. Angelica asks him who he is, and he tells her he's an ordinary man who became an adventurer after working as a clerk. But Angelica doesn't believe him. Rock decides to go all out in the battle, but Angelica surrenders, to his surprise. She decides to leave the arena, but Rick reminds her about the condition for the duel, telling her he would be using her conditions since he didn't state his. Angelica summons her last energy, and she puts them into her legs, getting out of the arena before Rick can say another word. Rick doesn't consider the duel a win because it doesn't feel right, but Rionette tells him Angelica already acknowledged her loss. Rionette suggests that they return to the guild because the results will soon be released. She also informs Rick that his masters will be visiting him to see how he is doing. The weight of this news is so overwhelming to Rick that he immediately has a meltdown. The Akashic Record, a treasure which grants any wish, is given to anyone who defeats Kaiser, the ultimate monster. An adventurer was unable to defeat the monster when he had an encounter with it, but he hoped that someday one of the upcoming adventurers would be able to bring down the beast and make up for his failure. Meanwhile, Alika announces to the adventurer that their test will be released momentarily. She tells them that mana will be sent to their exam tickets, and the tickets of those who passed would glow blue. She further informs them that the successful candidates will participate in a mock battle in the second stage the next day. Rick isn't in good spirits because he's not confident that he will pass, but Rionette consoles him, reassuring him that he would ace the test. She informs him that he would have to triple his training if he somehow fails the test, which makes Rick pray to all the existing deities to pass the test. His ticket suddenly lightens up, and he stares at it anxiously, wondering if he'll pass. His ticket glows blue after a while, and he rejoices, informing Rionette that he passed. She congratulates him on his success, and they leave the classroom as Rick expresses his relief because he doesn't have to return to training. A foul stench suddenly fills the air, and Rick can't help but cover his nose, wondering where the stench is from. A noble suddenly approaches Rionette and introduces himself as Raster, the first son of the Duke of Diamuit who rules over the north. Rick is having a hard time remembering his name, so he decides to call him Northy. Raster asks Rionette's name, and she introduces herself to him. While the Raster is marveled by how sweet Rionette's name sounds, he frowns at Rick when he introduces himself because he has no business with someone like him. Rick is heartbroken by this, but Raster doesn't care about that as he turns his attention back to Rionette. He tries using his not-so-superior line to pick up Rionette, but he can't even pique her interest in the slightest. Raster continues regardless, asking Rionette to become his second wife. Rick is fed up with his advances, and he decides to come in between them, which pisses off Raster, wondering why an old man was being so nosy. Rick informs Raster that he can't keep hitting on Rionette because she's his girlfriend. Raster is surprised to learn this, but notices Rick's participation ticket, which cracks him up. He can't believe Rick was still an F-rank hero in his old age. Rick assumes that Raster is also there for the exam and tries to pull an Uno reverse card on him, but Raster is disappointed with his assessment capabilities, telling him that he already made it to E rank when he was 14. He informs Rick that he's just there to be an examiner for the second part of the exam because he's an A-rank adventurer. Raster shows Rick his crest, and he asks Rionette to leave Rick because he's worse than a commoner and join him for dinner. Rionette kindly turns down his request, telling him that she's dating Rick, who's so red on his face that he almost explodes. She teases Raster, saying that his perfume has a disturbing smell which isn't very pleasant. Rick now knows where the origin of the smell is, but Raster is pissed off by their insults, and he promises to show Rick the difference in their capabilities if he ends up being his examiner. He walks away fuming, hoping to have a chance to prove to Rionette that she made the wrong decision. Rick didn't like that he was already starting on the wrong foot with his potential examiner. He hoped that Raster wouldn't turn out to be his examiner during the exam. Raster went for dinner at the castle, but was still fuming from his encounter with Rick. He promised himself that he would prove to Rick that he was superior to him. Fried and Angelica suddenly come running to him with tears running down their faces, and he's surprised by this, wondering what is making them sad. Fried tells him that he was disgraced by an old man during the test, while Angelica tells him that the same man almost disgraced her by explaining her dual oath. Raster is pissed that some old man had committed such an unforgivable sin, but then he suddenly figures out that the man could be Rick. He asks Fried for the old man's participant number, and Fried tells him it was an unlucky number, confirming his suspicions. Raster is pleased that he will have the chance to disgrace Rick during the second part of the exam, and also get his revenge for what he did to his siblings. The next day, Rick and Rionette are walking to the location of the second test when Rionette reminds Rick to hold back. Rick tells her he can't hold back, especially if Raster turns out to be his examiner. Rick is filled with dread at this possibility, but Lynx suddenly stops him on the way and informs him that he would be in charge of his test in the second stage. Rick is rejoicing because Raster isn't his examiner, but Lynx expresses how unusual it is for a 30-year-old receptionist to switch jobs and become an adventurer. Rick thinks Lynx is making fun of him, but Lynx expresses how impressed he is by his determination. Lynx is glad that a fellow middle-aged man like him can inspire others to chase their dreams regardless of their age. Lynx felt a sense of déjà vu because he became an adventurer at 24 years old, so he knew that Rick had a goal in mind. Lynx informs Rick that he's yet to achieve his dream of getting to a rank despite being in his 40s, because it took him 20 years to get to B rank. Rick was impressed by Lynx's passion at his age and eager to get into the mock battle with him. Lynx warns Rick that he won't hold back, but he gives him a handshake and invites him for a drink after the test. Around the corner, Raster is silently eavesdropping on their conversation with a naughty smile. Lynx felt how much Rick trained just by shaking his hand, so he decided to train even harder. As he returns to his quarters, Raster corners him so they can discuss. In the prep room, Rick is very cheerful, and Rionette notices this, but a messenger suddenly comes into the room, bearing news for participants numbered 4200 and above. He tells them Lynx has fallen ill, and their new examiner will be Raster Diamuit. Rick doesn't recognize the name till Rionette informs him that it's the Northy from the previous day. She tells him Raster may be related to Angelica and Fried since they all bear the same surname, and Rick can't believe his ears. The other participants express concern because they're scared of Raster. Rionette wonders what the big deal about him is, and one participant tells her that Raster is nicknamed the F-Rank Crusher because he torments participants that grab his attention. Rick realized that he was in a bad situation because he gained not just Raster's attention, but also his wrath. Raster enters a mock battle with one of the participants, and he easily defeats him with his nature-composed ice magic. He expresses his disappointment in how powerless commoners are, but an elite guard suddenly calls his attention to give him a message. Meanwhile, Rick was having a meltdown wondering what he would do to get out of his predicament, but Rionette tells him there's no point worrying. Rick tells her that he wants to go home, but he remembers that his training would triple if he does that, so he decides to make peace with the fact that he won't achieve his dreams. Rionette advises him to gain inspiration from others who tried to tell him he couldn't achieve his dreams instead of allowing their words to weigh him down. She assures him he will pass the test and defeat the perfume noble because she believes in him. She informs him that she always believed in him from the first day he decided to become an adventurer. Rick is so moved by her words that he regains his confidence. A hooded figure suddenly comes up to Rock and offers to help him through his midlife crisis through fortune-telling. The figure tells him he doesn't have to be suspicious, and he offers to give him a free trial first. Rick feels reassured by this, and he takes a seat with the figure. Rionette notices a spell on the seat, but she can't act quickly enough as Rick disappears as soon as he sits. Fried praises himself for being an Oscar-worthy actor because he got Rick to fall into his trap, but Rionette suddenly threatens him and asks him to spill the location where Rick was teleported to. Fried tries to be tough and withhold the information, but Rionette demonstrates her powers and Fried spills the beans like a broken tap head. He tells her that Rick isn't too far from their location because he can only manage to use teleportation magic within 100 meters of his location. Rick wonders where he is, wondering if he's behind the arena when suddenly surrounded by mercenaries hired by the elite guards. Rock thinks they have him mistaken, but they introduce themselves as the elite guards if Diamuit and Rick realize that Raster is behind his predicament. The guards promise to make sure he is in no condition to take the test, but Rick is disappointed that they have to resort to such dirty tricks. The chief guard informs him that they are all equivalent to B rank and are rank adventurers, and Rick realizes that he won't be able to get away unscathed. His masters suddenly come into view, wondering why Rick was outside the arena instead of taking his test. Rick tells Brufston that the guards are helping him train as an excuse, but the guards debunk his claims, threatening to take down his masters if they don't leave immediately. Rick begs the chief guard to call his men off, but he tells them to take down the masters instead. One of the guards tries to use his sword on Brufston, but his sword shatters as soon as it makes contact. Brufston expresses how impressed he is that the guard has trained his body, but he expresses disappointment at his negligence of weapon strengthening. The guard gets pissed off and tries to throw hands, but his fist is crushed like a cereal flake. Brufston heals his hand and advises him on improvements in his fighting form. The guards are surprised that an orc can talk and use magic. The chief guard suddenly recognizes them as the members of the strongest party. Mizet figures out that Rick is being bullied and decides to handle things peacefully with his newest invention, a custom gun with magic crystals and lead bullets. The other guards decide to go for the other masters since Brufston seems so powerful, but Mizet takes them down with his weapon. He asks Rick if he wants a shot with his weapon, but Rick turns down his request. The chief guard was now sure of his theory that they were members of the strongest party. Another guard threatens to take down Elisarette if anyone moves a muscle, but they advise him to let her go for his good. Elisarette wonders what the guard is doing, and Rick tells her he wants to play with her. Elisarette is open to playing with the guard, but he hurts her instead and she gets triggered. She unleashes a high-grade nature magic that sends the guard flying, to the horror of others. The chief now recognizes Elisarette, the vampire mage, who is the youngest and strongest magic user. Mizet, the half-elf half-dwarf, is the best weapons craftsman. A Shork, the orc with great intelligence and superhuman strength. The chief guard tells the other guards that they're all S-rank adventurers who are members of the Orichalcum Fist, the strongest party in the continent consisting of only S-rank adventurers. The chief guard is so entranced by their presence that he decides to retire and live in peace. Rick decides to return to his test while his master handles things. Meanwhile, Freed wonders how long Rionette would keep holding him hostage, and she tells him she would keep it up till Rick returns. Freed tells her Rick won't return because he's walking into an ambush by his family's elite guard. He's surprised when Rick comes back unscathed, and he wonders how he made it out without a scratch. Rick apologizes to him as Rionette tosses him away like a worthless rag doll. Lynx suddenly walks into the room looking hurt, and Rick helps him to a bed. Lynx informs Rick that Raster was the one who hurt him and made up the story that he fell ill. Lynx was disappointed that he couldn't stand a chance against Raster, but Rick wondered why Raster would go to such lengths just to be his examiner. Lynx recounts how Raster beat him up after he told him about his dream to build a school which kids who want to become adventurers can attend. Raster told him his dream was worthless because he could only manage to build up a third-rate school since he's a third-rate adventurer. Lynx is disappointed that he couldn't say something back to Raster and advises Rick to forfeit the exam so he doesn't experience a worse fate. Rick reassures Lynx, saying he will be fine as he steps out of the room towards the arena. Raster easily takes down another participant when one of his guards returns, apologizing for failing his mission. Raster is surprised that Rick still came out for the test because he thought he would be discouraged by everything he said against him. Raster decides to give Rick a taste of true suffering, but Rick is unfazed by his threats, silently promising to take him down for what he did to Lynx. Watch this next video. See you on the next one.